Welcome to the Zachrilege Cast podcast, YouTube video interview program that features me talking to some of the best and brightest in the atheist slash secular slash awesome community. This is episode number 194. I recorded this interview on June 18th, 2019. Thanks to Felicia and Amy for being on technically last week. I'm almost getting back to weekly show, everybody. Abortion, just do it. Open parens if you don't want kids, or if you have health issues, or if it's none of my fucking business, close parens. Check out Utah Outcasts, Secular Soup, and Right to Reason. Right to Reason, just listen to them. I had an idea when I thought about this week's guest. There is a nonprofit out there called Wounded Warrior, and the whole point of this is to help people who are coming back from war, who are having PTSD, having actual physical symptoms or emotional symptoms, but are being taken care of by their community. And who could possibly be a better, I would say, warrior, who is definitely wounded, than this week's guest. And we'll get here. But first, content warning: rape, child abuse, incest, and for some, Dungeons and Dragons. You can never be too sure. I did actual research this week, and I didn't want to bore my guests by spouting quotes when Reed's real-life stories were much more important to hear in the moment. I'll read them now for the captive podcast audience. A former Southern Baptist pastor who supported legislation in Texas that would have criminalized abortions has been arrested on charges of child sex abuse, accused of repeatedly molesting a teenage relative over the course of 2 years. We had given mercy to abusers when that mercy wasn't ours to give. We had given forgiveness to abusers when that forgiveness wasn't asked to give. Mercy and forgiveness comes from the victims and from God. Now, I would take the last 3 words away, but this is someone from the Baptist Convention. It's a perfect profession for a con artist, because all he has to do is talk a good talk and convince people that he's being called by God, and bingo, he gets to be a Southern Baptist minister, said Brown, who lives in Colorado. Then he can infiltrate the entirety of the SBC, move from church to church, from state to state, go to bigger churches and more prominent churches when he has more influence and power, and it all starts in some small church. In this week's episode, Conley tells about why her mom thinks Southern Baptists are too liberal, why she consumes ham to prove that a different Abrahamic God hadn't taken up space that the previous one vacated, why stay in touch with a hateful family, and how to create a new one. Ree is amazing, and with that, let's start the conversation.
I am Vince Clartho, Keymaster of Gozer. Vulcan Sildro, our Lord of the Cebulia. Are you the gatekeeper?
Welcome to the Zachrilege Cast! Ree Conley, welcome aboard.
Hi, thanks for having me.
How's it going this fine evening?
Pretty good.
Do you want to tell the audience? This is important, very, very critical information. Dragon's Milk, of course, official beer of the show. And I hear you are on the similar beer spectrum.
Yes, I love craft beer. Martin House is my current favorite brewery that's local to me, and have D&D nights. So I go out there and play D&D with about 150 other people and drink some craft beer.
Yeah, I think that's the smart thing now because there's so many breweries opening. I think St. Arnold's, which is in Houston, which isn't terribly close, a little close to you. They do like a Pumpkinator, which is like the one like October pumpkin kind of beer that I really like. I think it's like a barrel-aged pumpkin beer.
Mm-hmm.
But it's around. I had a friend mail me a few one year, and it was very, very good. But it's nice to see breweries do stuff like Mario Kart nights or video game nights, or just things to bring in different crowds because they're just ubiquitous right now.
Yeah, lots of key things to go out and do.
Exactly. Now, I do want to give the content warning for people listening, watching, all that. We're going to be discussing rape, incest, and child abuse tonight. And while I usually do out of context kind of jokey quotes, this is not a jokey quote, but it's from you. I'm sick of being told what I am, which is from the interview you did with Chris, which I'll probably be referencing a lot. He said he'd be in the chat room. I don't see him yet. You suck, Chris. I just get to say that. It's fun. We mean it and we don't. So according to the Houston Chronicle, since 1998, roughly 380 Southern Baptist church leaders and volunteers have faced allegations of sexual misconduct. As Ree surely knows, most of them work, or more of them work in Texas than in any other state. So you're on tonight to kind of talk about your own upbringing in Baptist church. And so I wonder if you could just kind of talk about your upbringing, the family situation with your mom, and I think it was a stepfather.
Yeah. Whenever I was 3, my mom married a preacher in a very small town, and he raped me and was having an incestual relationship with his 16-year-old daughter. And the community basically knew about it. He had been known to have raped all of his sisters as well. And he, whenever mom found out about me, she took me to the cops, and they sent us home and said that he was a good man and he was a community leader and that it was a family issue.
Now, was he involved really deeply in the church? Was he like a leader?
He was the preacher.
Oh, okay. So, and where was this? Like, where were you growing up?
Whenever this happened, it was Louisiana. We moved out to marry, and for her to marry him. I grew up in a very small town in Oklahoma. I grew up between Burlington, which is a town of about 200, and another town that's about 46,000 people, Enid, Oklahoma.
Actually, I heard of Enid. Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering where it was all located. So you mentioned that your mom took you to the cops. Now, your own, like your mom's upbringing, was she always very invested in the church?
My grandfather was very invested in the church. 2 of my uncles became pastors, and my mother became a youth pastor because in the church that I was raised in, it was believed that women were not allowed to speak in church with other adults. They could only speak to children because you're not supposed to speak in front of men.
And was this Baptist or just like independent?
It was called Independent Christian, and it was a small sect that I never really understood growing up. I would often ask my mom what exactly they were, but it was pretty much their own thing. If you think about West Barrow Baptist Church, it's very similar in beliefs and outreach.
Oh, before we got on, we were talking about your mom and what she said. Could you tell me what she said about Southern Baptist churches?
She thinks they're too liberal and that we should stay away from the children that go to that church.
That's something else, because Southern Baptist churches are not what many people would consider to be liberal. But when you mentioned the abuse, your stepfather, how old were you at the time?
I was 3. I was 3 when mom married him, and we stayed for a few months while she was married to him until she fled.
That's just like the most horrific thing somebody said in the history of this show. So I'm sorry that happened to you, but how long did that relationship go on? Was that kind of the end of that, or did it keep going for a while?
It kept going for a while. It kept going until He threw a Bible at my mother, and that was the last straw for her.
But he was physically abusive even after the fact?
Yes. Whenever we got home, he beat me to the point where I had 21 switch marks whenever we left. Because he whenever we got home from the police, he beat me pretty severely, and I still had scars like 2 years later.
Well, let me know whenever this is too much. You've
Okay.
shown from our interactions to be pretty strong with stuff, but yeah, let me know. But then your mom got into subsequent relationships, and they kind of continued in the similar pattern.
Yes. The longest relationship my mother was in was with a KKK member. And he was of the same faith. But less devout. But he was much the same as the preacher's name was Jimmy, so he was much the same as Jimmy.
But you had a bunch of like family members who were really involved, like
My
uncles and grandmother.
my grandmother, she whenever I was 19, she allowed her boyfriend to sexually assault me for 3 years, and my mother told me to just keep my mouth shut and take it, and that it was my duty to please men. And that's what their Bible taught them, their religion taught them, was that it was my place to please them, and my body was property of men.
Do you think the women in your family like had this belief, or is it like kind of just based on fear that they just kind of quoted this version of the Bible?
I think that they full-heartedly believed it.
And I don't have to assume because I kind of know the ending here, but when you were growing up, were you ever really devout, or did you always kind of have your doubts because of your just lived experience?
I was illegitimate, and so was told from basically from the time I was born that I was sinful and I shouldn't be around other children, and I was going to taint anyone that I was with, and that I was a whore by the sins of my mother. I whenever I was about 11 years old, I started reading the Bible to find out where they got these beliefs and to see if I could refute it in any way. And when I read, I'm not good at knowing the passages, scripture. I didn't care that much about learning the numbers and stuff. But when I read that they thought my mother should be stoned to death with me in her belly, I was pretty much done with it.
Yeah, it usually doesn't seem to take very long, and especially since people tend to start reading in the Old Testament,
Yeah.
which is the more hardcore version. Don't get to the part with the tattoos. But so you at a certain point, you were vocal about the fact that you didn't believe. What happened as a result, and how old were you?
I was 15-ish whenever that happened, and my mother sat me down with my preacher uncle, and that was the beginning of them outcasting me from the family. He said that it didn't matter that I was already a sin and that I was going to go to hell, so it didn't really matter what I believed.
But didn't they tell you that you had to believe or you're going to be kicked out?
My mother certainly did. Her boyfriend did. My uncle didn't think that I should already be part of the family.
That's got to be rough. So, I mean, all of this. But at what point were you able to, I guess, finally get out?
I got married when I was 21 and left my part of the world. I married an Arab, and whenever I did that, they washed their hands of me completely. And while I wasn't strong enough to care that they had been treating me in such a subpar manner, I couldn't handle the racism against my husband. And so I pretty much distanced myself from my entire family then.
Well, you showed them, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm everything that my mother pretty much abhors now. I'm an atheist. I am not straight, and I am poly. So my mother likes to call me a sinful whore a lot, and she basically just calls me when she needs me to take care of her.
Yeah, sounds about right. Well, so I wanted to get a little more into what the like role of the woman was in this version of Christianity. So at part of it, you're supposed to remain pure and chaste, but in the other part, you're supposed to do whatever a man wants sexually. Like, how is that actually something that can be accomplished?
Most things that society in general want women to be is not possible because we are supposed to be one thing and the exact opposite of that thing. So no, I don't think that is possible. Most children had fathers that would protect their maidenhood.
Yeah, like a T-shirt I saw at Target, a guy wearing like "Don't touch my tools or my daughter," and I'm like, oh boy,
Yeah.
that was not a good one.
My sister had a father. My mother was married to her father whenever they conceived her. And so I would often get told that they wouldn't do the same things to her as they would me because I didn't have a father.
I mean, you did. It's just, yeah, it's that the rules that they set, which oddly remind me of the kind of anti-abortion arguments. Like when you actually get into real life, then none of them seem to work ever. But that's the case. But this, you still have kind of relationship, at least with your mom and your grandmother. So what does your grandmother make you do every time you visit her?
She always asks before I come up if I eat pork. And then whenever we get there, she always has something pork. And then the excuse is that my mother loves ham. So I hate pork. Yeah, I put it in my mouth every single time I go home just to prove that I am not a Muslim now and I have not converted to what they think my husband should be instead of the atheist that I tell them that I am.
Yeah, isn't it actually worse in your family's eyes that your husband is now an atheist like you? Like they would actually accept him more if he was a fellow Abrahamic?
Yeah. I mean, whenever I got married, he didn't believe in organized religion, but he was still, he believed in God and that kind of stuff. And they completely outcast me then. But for us to claim that we are atheists now, it's like blasphemy. And my grandma always just goes, "It's just a phase."
Yeah, it might be a rest of your life phase, but she can live in hope anyway. So on your like husband's side, was it a similar situation with his
They do not.
family, or do they not even really care about the religion part?
No, they don't know.
Oh,
They're very devout. They are in Egypt, and so I don't have to deal with them much. And they don't speak English very well, so I don't have to speak to them basically at all. I really like his family. His family is very, very sweet, but it would be absolute blasphemy for them to find out the things that we are.
Well, was it a bit of? I mean, obviously, there's going to be some culture shock with a family from Egypt, but for you to deal with a family that, at least on the surface, seemed to be, I guess, normal compared to what you had to deal with growing up.
His family is amazing. I mean, he had an amazing childhood, and his mother is nothing but accepting and kind. And I haven't met his father, but he's even kinder in AJ's estimation than his mother. And I don't think you could get a better woman than AJ's mother. And the clash between him not understanding my family and how I can still care so much about them, and his feelings for his family has been one of those things that he had that like been a thing in our marriage that he hasn't been able to understand.
That's true. So you think like someone who lives in Texas, would you get more in trouble by the average person for not being a Christian or for being someone who doesn't like pork? Although I guess when it comes to barbecue, I think it's more of a beef thing in Texas.
It's definitely more beef in Texas. Pork in Texas is not a thing that anyone cares about. But it's all about that brisket, and I go after that brisket. So I'm a good Texan.
Yeah, someone who grills a lot. I have not attempted brisket yet. I get nervous because it is definitely a difficult thing to do, but the entire state, people get crazy about, regional differences in barbecue. Like only certain parts of the country are allowed to do it. And I think, isn't it more about technique? I mean, I know it's part of the country, but at this point, you can get anything anywhere. But it sounds like that would not be a bad, taste experience for sure.
Brisket is one of my favorite food. So
And this tends to come up with people who label themselves as queer. Do you think it's tougher for your family to deal with that aspect of who you are, or the part of the non-religious side of you?
when I told my mother that I was okay, so my mother was sitting there watching a show, and a kid came out to the parent, and she said that she would kick out any child um, that came out as queer. And so I came out then. I was like, I 100% do not think you will kick me out. And I am in love with someone that is a female. And she backed down immediately. But after that, she would always be like, I'm so sad that you're going to hell. And she I don't know. She kind of accepts me being atheist because she can't do anything about it. I made it pretty clear that she has no boundaries on that one anymore.
And do you think that it's easier to accept kind of what I guess mainstream society would consider alternate relationship structure, I guess, for a better
My mom
than what you grew up, because you grew up in such a formal, like, not just you're supposed to be monogamous, you're supposed to get married and do whatever the guy says and a bunch of kids.
Mm-hmm.
Never complain that you're more open than to having being poly, to being.
Yeah, my mom has a huge problem with me being poly. Every single time that I talk to her, she calls me a sinful whore.
It's just something I don't think a lot of moms would call the daughters, but I've obviously had a very charmed life so far.
Yeah, I don't particularly. If I bring up my boyfriend, she goes, she says terrible things to me every single time. Even though my boyfriend is much more the type of person that she would. Sorry, my husband just got home, so my dog is going to go off for a second.
Dog interruption, everybody.
I was saying that my boyfriend is much more the type of person that my family would accept. He's a veteran. He's white. He's everything that my family would want in a partner for me. But because they think that it's terrible that I am, quote unquote, cheating on my husband, and I'm supposed to be subservient to my husband, that is the worst thing that I could possibly do.
Seems like there are a lot of worse things you could do, and you're just doing them all. It's just that's just who you are, but it's just, yeah, okay, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I am judged more harshly than my sister, who has had a much harder adulthood than me. And because she's still a Christian, she doesn't get the judgment and blame.
So after all you've been through, why do you work so hard to kind of keep the family relationships that you've had?
Because I am very dutiful as a human being, and I feel responsibility and obligation towards taking care of my mother, especially since she had 3 strokes since 2008. She's a very intelligent woman, and very other than when it comes to men, very strong-willed. But she lost everything. She was actually a foster care counselor whenever she had a stroke. And she was working with children that had been abused. And then now she's not anything anymore. She can barely speak.
So does she live close to you?
She still lives in Enid, Oklahoma, and I live in Dallas, Texas, which is about a 4-hour drive in between.
It's pretty far. So how often do you get to see her?
As little as humanly possible.
As little as humanly possible.
I can usually go a few months between her demanding me come up.
What do you think that the kind of the independent nature of Baptist church and then just kind of the Christian church you grew up in, do you think that causes more problems when it comes to reporting sexual abuse and actually having some kind of system where there might even be some kind of database where people can look up people before hiring them, or if they actually cared?
No, absolutely not. I think that churches that have hierarchy just cover it up throughout the entire hierarchy. And independent churches, it's more of a what kid is actually going to step forward and win. And it's probably more told. But the issue is that Catholics are more liberal and see it as more of a sin to harm children than Southern Baptists and the church I grew up in.
So the Baptist church is less, I guess, defensive of children's rights then?
If women are property, children are even more so.
And is it kind of literally in line with scripture for a man of the family to have ownership over his family, female family, including a sexual manner, or maybe even male?
It's a sexual manner for women, of course. From the time you're born, you are your father's or your brother's, and then when you get married, you're your husband's.
So if you grew up to become the proper lady that your mom thought you would be, What would that be? How
Um,
opposite of how you are would that be?
I would probably have like 3 children by now at least, and I would probably be a stay-at-home mom, and I would have my entire life devoted to my children. I don't have children yet. Not for want. I definitely want children, but I haven't had them yet. And once you hit 30 in their society, um, if you don't have children yet, you don't have any value.
So that's another issue you probably have with the family.
Yes.
Even though I think your grandmother said she hoped you wouldn't have children
Uh,
with
the
your husband.
Yeah, the day after I got married, I got married in a courthouse. Oh, it was just us. So I guess we eloped. Um, and the day after, I told my grandmother that I married him, and she went, "You're not going to have kids with him, are you?" That was literally the first thing that she said to me. She didn't say hi. She didn't say anything else. She said, "You're not going to have kids with him, are you?"
Well, does that religious, because like in the Catholic Church, in theory, you're not supposed to get divorced. Like you can't get divorced. You have to like annul a marriage. Is that the same? Or
Not for my grandma. My grandmother was divorced 3 times, so my grandma doesn't really care. It's very much a big thing for my grandfather. My grandmother is not of the independent church she was whenever my mother was little. Then she changed churches whenever I was a child. Um, so she didn't have as strict of rules. My grandfather, on the other hand, said that any marriages after divorce or adultery, and he did get remarried after he divorced my grandmother when my mother was 6, and so he would not be a deacon of the church, and he kept himself out of the leadership of the church because he felt like he was such a sinner.
that's just, just crazy talk. But I guess it all is. So we've obviously talked a lot about how women are seen in kind of the community you grew up in, but how are men kind of victims? Like, how does the kind of limitations of what men can express in terms of emotions affect them as well?
Men are only allowed one emotion in especially more patriarchal societies that I grew up in, and that emotion is anger. And to be only allowed to express one emotion, um, um, you lose a range of abilities to be anything other than a ball of anger, and expressing your emotions and being a full functioning human is not something you can be. And responsibility on men's shoulders in these societies is immense. And so you have to have a range of emotions other than just anger.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned that like responsibility is heavy on the man's shoulders, but when it comes to anything sexual, it seems like all the responsibility is the woman.
The house and sex are on the woman's shoulders.
Okay, well, there you go. 50-50? No, not so much. Um, well, when you were growing up, how did you deal with what happened to you, and how do you deal with that now?
As a child, I pretty much just buried every emotion that I had. I didn't really express myself very well as a child. I was very angry, um, but as an adult, I got diagnosed with PTSD in 2007. And I have resumed counseling, and I am getting the help now that I to overcome a lot of these issues. And a lot of the issues have been dealt with by helping others.
Well, it's a positive way to deal with what you've been through.
Thank you.
And obviously you have a story to share with somebody else who either has gone through something like this or, I mean, any kind of stress, to be honest. Now, one of the stories that was mentioned when you talked with Chris was a story about a girl who was basically raped in a Baptist church. And then she had to apologize to the church because the guy was cheating on his wife. So why is there this, like it would seem it would be very obvious, like, why would you care, like, that the church is going to punish you after you've been raped because of the church? Why is it like such a strong pull towards someone to say I'm sorry to something that happened to them that should have been a crime? Well, was a crime, but wasn't going to be prosecuted.
You are brainwashed from the time you're born in these societies, and you are taught that if you do not do as the church says, you're going to hell. I mean, the immense amount of power that these men have, that they alone decide your fate if you're going to be tortured for the rest of your life. Tell a small child that from the time they're born, you don't have any choice other than to follow what they say.
Do you still have a fear of hell?
No, not at all. That went before my Christianity did, I think. Whenever I was like, I don't know, 12, I told my mother I was Jewish so that she would stop making me eat pork. And
Man, that thing with pork.
I really ate pork, if you can't tell.
You should have said Judeo-Christian, because that's get out of jail free.
It was fine in it was fine with my mom if I was Jewish. I don't know why. That was fine. But also in the Jewish faith, hell is not such a huge ordeal.
Yeah, you just kind of stop existing. I think that's the deal. Well, I don't even think like the Christian New Testament hell really existed till like Dante. It was a later kind of thing that showed up.
Yeah.
So it definitely came in with Jesus, all happy, slappy, hippie Jesus. Definitely was like, no, you're going to hell.
Yeah.
And you say you go to hell and you die. my
mother also really hated the preachers that would go up there and scream damnation. I don't believe that my mother believes that she's going to heaven. And so it would always terrify her whenever the preachers would do that. And she wasn't, she is now, she quite often tells me how sad she is that I'm going to hell in a completely sincere way, which kind of breaks my heart whenever she says it because of the fear that she holds for me. But yeah, she has a huge fear of hell, but I don't think that she she's not really a you're going to hell in an angry way type person.
Yeah, it's like the threat that often comes from religious people to atheists is like, well, we don't even believe in that, so it's an imaginary threat. So, but what isn't imaginary is the fact that it's Pride Month, and it's been like a weird Pride Month. It seems like there's, I don't know, but in your local area, what are you doing to celebrate?
I am running a D&D mini convention. We have 60 people signed up to come and play D&D and board games and stuff for a Pride Day event at my local comic book shop. I am hosting this with my boyfriend. We're both pansexual, and so we are hosting this event.
Is it a BYOB?
If the owner of the shop had any say in it, everything would be BYOB. He's a pretty awesome guy.
Well, there's a local like comic shop, but they also have like old video games, and they also have a pretty decent beer selection. So it's not a terrible place to go to.
Sounds like an awesome place to go to.
Yeah, exactly. You ever get to Atlanta? I know Dragon Con's here, although it always happens at the same weekend.
I really want to go to Dragon Con, so I might come out there sometime.
Well, you talked about, you kind of teased this on Chris's show. You didn't really get into it because, you were talking about your own personal story. But so how do you get involved with kind of sex education, especially since you're in Texas, where they teach the kind of sex education that the anti-abortion people like?
Yeah, abstinence only is the only thing that is legal in Texas, which has caused many issues. And it's even worse under our current governor, who took funding away from AIDS research to do more abstinence-only education. But I run a couple of Facebook groups that are about sex, and one is very focused on sex education with a lot of younger people. They're all about 18 to 25, and I do a lot of outreach there, talking about how to have safe sex and how stigmas aren't really things and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, do you get to kind of talk to the version of yourself when you were that age because you weren't taught anything when you grew up?
I actually, because I was raped when I was 3, my mother did not hold any sex education away from me. So I have been educating people about sex since I was little. I remember sitting in the library whenever I was like 9 years old and teaching a girl about periods, and her family was just as devoutly conservative as mine, and she hadn't ever heard of the things that I was teaching her about her body. And I like got books out and started teaching her all about how her body works and stuff. So I kind of self-taught. There was a human physiology book that my mother had for university, and I went through it and learned a lot about our human bodies and how the woman's body works and stuff. And then I would go and teach other kids about it.
Well, if you had an opportunity to go up and talk in front of the church you were in growing up, or churches, what would your talk be about? And how quickly do you think you'd be pushed off stage?
I don't think that I would very much be welcome in the church that I grew up in. It's very much my family takes up 2 rows of church space. I'm pretty sure I would be barred from the doors from the beginning. But if I got in and I had a speech about it, I would talk about how women are human beings with the same emotional range as men, and that we have intelligence and the ability to make our own decisions.
That would be mind-blowing. I mean, it's like, we let a woman talk, in front of like the little kids, but not the older kids, even though
it's 12 and under that women are allowed to speak to in my church.
Well, there are other ways in your life besides D&D where you get your nerdiness cred.
I'm gamer. I've been playing Mass Effects lately. I play lots and lots of D&D. My schedule is overbooked I read comics. I read fantasy novels. I just finished The Warded Man, which was incredible. But it has incest too, so content warning on that as well.
Well, I was thinking I had just finished like the Game of Thrones books, and then I had a holdout in the library for the audio version of the 5th book, and I'm like, sure, why not listen to it again? 48 hours and 21 days. I can do it. But yeah, incest, by the way.
Yeah.
And kind of like partially celebrated, partially not. I mean, it kind of depends on the point of view.
I don't really have
not from
much
people who
problem
listen,
with
but the characters in the book are like, oh, that's fine. Yeah.
I don't really have much problem with Jamie and Cersei. As long as they're healthy and happy. I mean, I have problems with Jamie raping Cersei, but I don't have much problem with when they're happy and healthy.
Yeah, it was kind of what they both wanted. And it was the kind of thing that was accepted because of the whole Targaryen thing. And say, hey, go into the game, every episode Game of Thrones, people. It's just what happens. It's just natural offshoot of things. Well, how did you get, I mean, we're getting toward the end of the time, but how did you get into programming?
I was a history major in university. And I was very, very bored. Very, very bored. And I was doing web design on the side. And so I just made that more of my thing. And then I went into Android development.
It's weird when people, I think it's harass female content creators. They say, learn to code, and you have. So in your face.
Yep.
So is there anything that we haven't covered that you want to talk about?
I think we've covered pretty much everything. It's been enjoyable talking to you.
Well, thank you for being on. So other than like Dragon Con, are there other conference type things you'd want to attend?
Emerald Con, Gen Con. I'm going to Reaper Con, which is a local Texas con at the end of August, beginning of September. It's Labor Day weekend. And I am so excited, and I am hoping that they're going to allow me to DM, which means be a dungeon master and lead games. I've signed up to be a dungeon master, but I haven't heard back on if I'm going to be allowed to be one yet.
Would you have like a resume for that sort of thing, or you just have to know what you're talking about?
You kind of have to have a resume. Kind of, sort of.
Kind of, sort of. Well, that sounds excellent. Well, thank you, Ree, for being on. Thank you for sharing your experiences. I feel like a lot of people who've been in religious situations and gotten out are the people I admire most, because I never was in there, and especially the female perspective. So thanks again for doing that, and for being brave and just being you.
Thank you for having me on.
When someone asks you if you're a god, you say yes.
Live read. You know, unlike last week's episode, I actually kept this week's episode to the about 45-minute length, so I could wax whatever the hell I do in this part of the show, but I'm going to hold off. I'm probably supposed to give my hot take on the Parkland shooting survivor who lost his spot at Harvard for being absolutely racist. It's not sad to see the right-wing grifters defend a man who said horrible shit as a 16-year-old. It's sad to see skeptics, trademark, defending him as well. It tends to be the worst of our lot, the ones who may have more in common with Ree's family than they would like to admit, who defend free speech when it has consequences. And I'm not even going to do a show link this week. Find your own show. Find your own path. If you want to support this show, be like Freethinker215, Chris Watson of Podunk Polymath, Bobby, Ashley, Hugh, Teody, Larry, Daryl, and the other Daryl, and go to patreon.com/Zachrilege. I need your money way more than those pajama guys. Actually, I don't. But, you know, it would just make me feel warm inside, and you get cat videos. Cat videos. Follow me on Twitter at Zachrilege, like my Zachrilege Cast page on Facebook, and send all mail to zachrilege.cast@gmail.com. Thank you to Ree for being on tonight. And I'm actually going to be reaching out to an Australian podcasting host who might be able to give me the greatest interview in show history. That's right, I'm going to potentially talk to God. So until next time, let's continue the conversation.